Qatar has signed an agreement with Boeing to purchase 160 aircraft, the largest wide-body aircraft order in the American company's history.
In May 2025, Kelly Ortberg, Boeing's CEO, announced the largest wide-body aircraft order in the company's history, a diplomatic spectacle, up to 210 planes for Qatar Airways. 1 year later, China approved an initial purchase of 200 Boeing aircraft, the first Chinese commitment to purchase American-made Boeing aircraft since 2017. Within days, Boeing stock rose. Even as the families of 346 people who died in the two 737 MAX crashes were still appealing in court. So already here, you might be thinking that Boeing is more strategically embedded than it looks, and that it got back to this point through a geopolitical logic hiding in plain sight. I don't think there's another story quite like this one. Most people, when they think of Boeing, think of airplanes. That's understandable. The name is on the side of the plane. It's on the safety card in the seat pocket. It's the brand you see when you're walking down the jetway, when you're quietly deciding whether the flight feels steady enough. What I want to show you is what Boeing actually is measured, not by what you see, but by where its money comes from. In 2024, a year marked by a $10.7 billion operating loss. The same year, a door plug separated from a Boeing 737-9 after takeoff from Portland. 42% of Boeing's consolidated revenue came not from commercial aviation, but from the US government, defense, space, security, and foreign military sales. Defense, space, security, and foreign military sales. Would you believe that 42% of Boeing's revenue in a year of severe financial strain came from the American state? The company you think of when you picture a boarding pass is, by that measure, already more of a defense and government services operation than a commercial aircraft manufacturer. It just happens to put its name on planes that carry you to your sister's wedding. In April 2025, Kelly Ortberg, the engineer, brought in to replace Boeing's previous CEO, testified before the United States Senate. He said Boeing supports 1.8 million American jobs. He said this in Senate testimony as part of a broader argument tying Boeing's recovery to US jobs, exports, and national security. He was not wrong about the numbers. By early 2026, Boeing's total order backlog had reached $695 billion. That's not revenue. That is Boeing's total order backlog, future work awaiting fulfillment, not current year revenue. The question is what that number means for a company that has spent the past 7 years trying to convince the world it has changed. Because what I want to figure out with you is this: when a company this large, this embedded in the machinery of American power, enters a severe financial and credibility crisis, who actually decides whether it gets to come back? The standard version of this story goes something like this. Boeing had a catastrophic safety failure, 2 crashes, 346 people dead. A door plug that separated mid-flight, congressional hearings, leadership departures, federal investigations. And then, slowly, the company started to fix itself. New leadership, new processes, new culture, and the orders came back. That version is not wrong, but it leaves something out. When I look at the actual sequence of events, not the press releases, the timeline, I keep finding something that doesn't fit the standard frame. In May 2024, the US Department of Justice told a federal court that Boeing had breached its criminal agreement, the deferred prosecution agreement that had let Boeing avoid a criminal trial over a conspiracy charge tied to misleading the FAA about MAX changes. Breaching it meant the original charge was back on the table, a criminal trial or guilty plea path reopened. That is as serious as it sounds. Then, over the following 12 months, the US Air Force selected Boeing for the F-47 program. Kelly Ortberg stood before the United States Senate and framed Boeing's recovery in terms of US national security and exports. And Qatar Airways and Boeing announced the largest wide-body order in Boeing history. By November 2025, the criminal charge had been dismissed entirely. I am not telling you these things are connected. I am telling you they happened in that order. So the question isn't whether Boeing recovered. Parts of it clearly did, and we'll get to that. The question is what kind of recovery this was and what it required. I've gone through the government reports, the court filings, the testimony. What I kept finding was the same question, coming back in different forms. Can a country honestly regulate a company it also desperately needs? I don't know the answer, but I think the record on Boeing is one of the clearest case studies we have for asking it. To understand what Boeing became, you have to understand what it chose. The choice that set the crisis in motion didn't happen in a crash. It happened in 2012, when Boeing entered the 737 MAX certification path. They could pursue a clean sheet airplane, a genuinely new design. Or they could update the 737, an existing airframe preserving fleet commonality and minimizing retraining for pilots. They chose the second option. That decision had recognizable logic. The House report documented how Boeing sought to preserve commonality and minimize training burdens. Retraining pilots costs money. The derivative path had real commercial momentum. By certification in March 2017, the MAX had become Boeing's fastest-selling airplane ever, with more than 3,600 orders from 83 customers. The room was telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. But inside that same process, something else was happening. As Boeing pursued the derivative certification path, the system at the center of what followed was MCAS. Boeing's engineers built it to address handling characteristics that arose under the derivative approach. MCAS became the focus of both crashes investigations around sensor logic and training assumptions. The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee released its final report in September 2020. What they documented was something more familiar than a conspiracy. The record shows training pressure, cost incentives, and internal messages that made safety concerns look economically inconvenient. One engineer, in an internal message quoted in the congressional report, described talking an airline out of requesting additional simulator training for MAX pilots. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "I just Jedi mind tricked this fools." He said he'd saved the company a sick amount of money. He was not a villain. He was a person responding exactly as the system had trained him to respond. Speed mattered. Cost mattered. Another employee, around the same time, wrote about the MAX's pilot training program. He wrote, "Would you put your family on a MAX simulator-trained aircraft? I wouldn't." It doesn't look like cowardice from the inside. It looks like a calculation the system had designed him to make. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed in Indonesia, killing 189 people. Investigations intensified around MCAS, training assumptions, and sensor logic. 5 months later, on March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed, killing 157 people, 346 people, across 2 planes, 5 months apart. The MAX was grounded worldwide on March 13th. 26 days after the second crash, Dennis Muhlenberg, Boeing's CEO, said publicly, "We own safety." The MAX returned to service in November 2020. Muhlenberg was removed. Dave Calhoun came in to manage the aftermath. For a while, it looked like the story had found its ending. Then, January 5th, 2024. Alaska Airlines Flight 1282. After takeoff from Portland, the left mid-exit door plug separated from the aircraft. 7 passengers and 1 flight attendant received minor injuries. Nobody died, which is the only reason this is not the worst aviation story of the decade. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated for over a year. Their conclusion was not about software, not about sensor integration, not about any of the engineering complexities that defined the MAX crashes. It was about 4 bolts.
This just in, NTSB investigators say 4 bolts that hold the door plug in place on the Boeing 737 MAX 9 were missing at the time of last month's blowout on Alaska.
4 bolts that were supposed to secure the door plug to the airframe. The NTSB found those bolts were missing before the airframe was delivered to Alaska Airlines. Not from where? Missing from the factory. Someone had opened the door plug during a rework process. That required removing the bolts. No removal record was generated. Without that record, the inspection that would have confirmed the bolts were reinstalled was never triggered. A form that nobody filled out. In February 2024, an FAA-released expert panel report found evidence of a disconnect between Boeing senior management and the broader organization on the question of whether raising safety concerns was actually safe. In April 2024, a Boeing quality engineer named Sam Sailapur testified before the United States Senate. He had worked on Boeing's wide-body aircraft programs. In Senate testimony, he said, "There is no safety culture at Boeing." He described being retaliated against for raising concerns. He described a supervisor who told him, in a meeting, that he would have killed anyone who said what Sailapur had said. I am not telling you this proves Boeing was beyond saving. By May 2024, the DOJ found Boeing had breached its deferred prosecution agreement, reopening a criminal trial or guilty plea path. By the spring of 2024, Boeing was entering what the record describes as a second full-spectrum credibility crisis, combining quality failures, legal exposure, and safety culture scrutiny simultaneously. Not just a quality crisis, not just a legal exposure, those had marked Boeing's story for years. What was different now was that the FAA, the DOJ, and Congress were all scrutinizing Boeing's claims of reform at the same time. In January 2024, the FAA halted further MAX production expansion, formally in writing.
They even imposed a production cap on Boeing 737 MAX. That's still in place. Ortberg denies directing crews to speed up production.
No additional production lines or rate increases until quality control issues were resolved, and the FAA shifted to a more interventionist posture, enhanced on-site oversight, manufacturing investigations, and corrective action plans. Their statement was unusually direct. This won't be back to business as usual for Boeing. That sentence was not written for a press release, it was written to be a policy. Then, three things happened. The first was structural. In July 2024, Boeing announced it would acquire Spirit AeroSystems, a key manufacturing supplier and crucial part of Boeing's outsourced production chain, for roughly $4.7 billion in stock. Spirit had been independent since 2005, when Boeing spun it off as part of a broader outsourcing architecture. The acquisition was a dramatic reversal of that architecture, what the record describes as an implicit admission that supplier fragmentation had become strategically intolerable. Except, and this is worth holding, the NTSB had found the Alaska door plug bolts were missing not at Spirit's facility, at Boeing's own plant in Renton. Boeing was not just buying back a supplier, it was reversing a corporate doctrine at considerable expense, while the evidence pointed at itself. The second was personnel. In July 2024, the board announced that Dave Calhoun would be replaced by Kelly Ortberg, an engineer who had spent more than 35 years in aerospace leadership, most recently as CEO of Rockwell Collins and through its integration into Collins Aerospace. Calhoun left. Ortberg arrived. The crisis did not. The third came from outside the company entirely. In May 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice told a federal court that Boeing had breached its criminal agreement, a deferred prosecution agreement that had let Boeing avoid a criminal trial over a conspiracy charge tied to misleading the FAA about MAX changes. Breaching it meant the original charge was back on the table. A criminal trial or guilty plea path reopened. A federal judge rejected a proposed plea agreement in December 2024. The case remained open. Then, in the months that followed, the U.S. Air Force selected Boeing for the F-47 program. Qatar Airways and Boeing announced an order for up to 210 wide-body aircraft, the largest wide-body order in Boeing history. And in April 2025, Kelly Ortberg testified before the United States Senate Commerce Committee. He said, Boeing has made serious missteps in recent years, and it is unacceptable.
Serious missteps in recent years, and it's unacceptable. In response, we've made sweeping changes.
He tied Boeing's recovery explicitly to U.S. national security and exports. He mentioned the fighter program. He cited 1.8 million jobs. The admission and the argument lived in the same testimony. In May 2025, the same month the Qatar order was announced, the Department of Justice reached a non-prosecution agreement with Boeing, letting the company resolve the criminal case short of trial or felony conviction. By November 2025, the federal court dismissed the case. I want to be careful about what I say here, because it would be easy to read this as corruption or as power protecting itself. I am not sure that's the right frame. If you're sitting in Washington in the spring of 2025, you are not choosing between justice and impunity. You are choosing between two sets of costs. One is borne by the families of people who died. The other is borne by the American defense industrial base and by the workers across Boeing's manufacturing base who build these planes. I don't think the people who made that calculation were corrupt. I think they were doing exactly what the system had designed them to do. The families of MAX crash victims appealed. By March 2026, the Fifth Circuit denied an initial mandamus petition. By April 2026, rehearing petitions remained active while the court withheld its mandate. The process was not over. Four things happened after the DOJ found Boeing in breach. Each one followed the same logic, and it's only when you put them next to each other that the pattern becomes visible. The first, defense. The U.S. Air Force selected Boeing for the F-47 program, a next-generation fighter. What I can tell you is what Ortberg did with the announcement. He mentioned it in his Senate testimony, not as context as an argument, as evidence that Boeing's recovery and American military capability were now intertwined. The F-47 selection was, in his framing, evidence that the US government had already signaled that Boeing's continued existence at scale was a national interest. That argument had a specific function in that room. Ortberg was testifying about crashes, about a door plug, about compliance failures, and in the middle of that, he introduced something that had nothing directly to do with safety. It was not dishonest. Boeing does build fighter jets. The national security argument is real. But it was also a move, and once you see it, you recognize it everywhere. The second supply chain, the Spirit AeroSystems acquisition, closed in December 2025. The acquisition reversed the outsourcing architecture Boeing had built over 2 decades, what the record describes as an implicit admission that supplier fragmentation had become strategically intolerable. They have utilized the language of safety and quality, combined with drawing 42% of their revenue from the US government, to undo 20 years of outsourcing doctrine and call it reform. I'm not saying the reversal was wrong. I'm saying the framing deserves scrutiny. The third, the Gulf. On May 14, 2025, Qatar Airways and Boeing announced an order for up to 210 wide-body aircraft, the largest wide-body order in Boeing's history. A White House fact sheet described the deal as part of more than $243.5 billion in US-Qatar economic commitments. The Boeing order and GE Aerospace engine sales were presented as part of the broader US-Qatar economic package. A commercial airline order planes, a carrier buys to fly passengers listed as a line item in a presidential summit outcome document. At that point, Boeing's commercial recovery had become something else as well. It had become statecraft, a number a president could read from a podium. Boeing said the deal would support approximately 400,000 American jobs, their own figure, and worth noting as such. I want you to notice what happens when a commercial transaction gets absorbed into the machinery of diplomatic achievement. It stops being evaluated on commercial terms. It starts being evaluated on geopolitical terms. And geopolitical terms are, by design, harder for anyone outside the room to challenge. The fourth, China. You heard this at the beginning of the video. On May 20, 2026, the week I finished going through this record, China committed to purchasing 200 Boeing aircraft, the first commitment to purchase American-made Boeing aircraft since 2017. The White House presented it as a diplomatic outcome. Not Chinese airlines assessed Boeing's safety improvements and resumed purchasing. The framing was, 2 governments negotiated, and Boeing was one of the results. I have no evidence that Chinese airlines were pressured. I don't know what was discussed in those rooms. What I know is that by May 2026, Boeing's commercial recovery and American diplomatic outcomes had become so intertwined that separating them required more information than the public record provides. In 2025, Boeing delivered 600 commercial aircraft, up from fewer than 350 the year before. That is real progress. Genuine work. I want to give that what it deserves. Airbus delivered 793. Boeing's recovery, measured against itself, looks like a comeback. Measured against the competitor it is supposed to be competing with, it looks like a company still operating below where it was before the crisis began. And then there is what was happening on the parallel track. In September 2024, Senate investigators found documents showing Boeing workers still felt pressure to prioritize speed over quality, not in 2018. In 2024, after the door plug, after the hearings, after years of promised cultural change. The FAA's expert panel had made dozens of specific recommendations. The FAA said it agreed with every one. And Kelly Ortberg, in his 2025 annual letter to shareholders, wrote, "We have not turned the corner just yet." 2 timelines. Timeline A. May 2025 largest wide-body order in Boeing's history. May 2025 DOJ reaches non-prosecution agreement. December 2025 Spirit acquisition closes. May 2026 China commits to 200 aircraft. May 2026, Boeing passes the FAA's capstone review, enabling a move toward higher production rates. Timeline B. September 2024, workers still feeling pressure to prioritize speed. April 2026, families of MAX crash victims still appealing in court. And Boeing's own CEO writing to the people who own the company, saying the corner has not yet been turned. Timeline A describes what the world was willing to give Boeing. Timeline B describes what Boeing had actually become. I'm not going to tell you what to make of that gap. I want to go back to that moment in May 2025. Qatar Airways and Boeing announced the largest wide-body order in Boeing's history, up to 210 wide-body aircraft. It was framed by a White House fact sheet as part of more than $243.5 billion in U.S. Qatar economic commitments. When I first came across that announcement, early in my research, I read it as a recovery story, a company that had severely damaged itself, finding its way back. I don't read it that way anymore. Not because it isn't real. The order is real. Boeing said the deal would support approximately 400,000 US jobs. But an announcement framed by presidential statements and diplomatic achievement language is not the same thing as a company that has earned back the trust it lost. Those are two different destinations. And in the spring of 2025, Boeing arrived at one of them. The company that lost trust because it treated safety discipline as negotiable, recovered in part because the state could not afford to treat Boeing's survival as negotiable. That dynamic is worth sitting with. Scale was Boeing's deepest vulnerability and its greatest protection at the same time. Scale is how risky cultural assumptions spread across an organization, across certification, training, production, and supplier networks, so gradually that the pattern becomes hard to see from inside. It's also how a company becomes impossible to simply remove too many jobs, too many defense programs, too many transactions between governments tied to Boeing's continued solvency. I'm not saying this was corrupt. The people who made this calculation were weighing real costs on both sides, and I'm genuinely not certain I would have decided differently. What Boeing's case makes visible is how advanced industrial democracies handle failure inside strategic companies, the entanglement of corporate accountability with export diplomacy, criminal law, labor, defense, and national power. There is a question I kept coming back to throughout this entire record. Not was Boeing's comeback real. Parts of it clearly were. Not were the people who approved it corrupt. I don't think that's the right frame. The question is simpler and harder. Can a country honestly regulate a company it also desperately needs? I don't know. I've read the public record on this case. I still don't know. The families are still appealing. The backlog is $695 billion.